Silas pressed me back against the cold, iron shelving of the archive vault, his body a wall of living heat that contrasted sharply with the chilled, stagnant air of the basement. The smell of old parchment, dust, and rain-dampened wool swirled around us, but all I could truly sense was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of his heart against my own chest. His hand, calloused and large, slid upward from my waist, tracing the line of my ribs with a slow, agonizing deliberation that made my breath hitch in the back of my throat. We were supposed to be pretending. This was the lie we had crafted to save my legacy, the charade we played for the prying eyes of the town. Yet here in the shadows where no one could see us, the mask wasn't just slipping, it was shattering. His thumb brushed the underside of my jaw, tilting my head back, and I saw the darkness in his eyes, a storm of hunger that had nothing to do with the script we'd written. The air between our lips was electric, vibrating with everything we hadn't said, and as he leaned in, the scent of cedar and ozone filling my lungs, I realized with a terrifying jolt that I no longer remembered where the act ended and where I began. When skin touched skin, this is how the whisper of the forbidden echoed. Before we move on to the rest of the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications to be informed about upcoming videos, and write in the comments where you are watching us from. Tonight's story was submitted anonymously by a listener from Seattle, Washington. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in places where history is kept. It's not the absence of sound, but rather the weight of 1,000 whispered secrets held within the fibers of decaying paper and the ink of long-dead hands. I have lived in that silence for most of my adult life. As the head archivist for the small, coastal county of Oakhaven, my world was measured in acid-free boxes, white cotton gloves, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that had seen more decades than I had seen years. I liked the predictability of it. I liked that the past stayed where you put it. But the present? The present was a chaotic, fraying thread that threatened to unravel everything I had built. My name is Clara, and for 3 years, I had been fighting a losing battle against the town's most prominent developer, a man who happened to be my ex-fiancé, Lyle. He wanted to turn my sanctuary, the Oakhaven Historical Repository, into a boutique shopping plaza. To him, the building was just prime real estate with a view of the gray, churning Atlantic. To me, it was my mother's legacy, the only thing I had left of a woman who had taught me that our stories are the only things that truly belong to us. The board of directors, men and women who smelled of mothballs and greed, were leaning toward his proposal. They claimed I was too isolated, too unstable since my mother's passing, and that the archives needed a fresher, more community-focused direction. In a moment of sheer, panicked desperation during a heated board meeting, I had blurted out that I wasn't alone, that I was engaged to the consultant who had been seen coming and going from the basement for weeks. That consultant was Silas. He wasn't a fiancé. He wasn't even a friend. He was a man I had hired to help me digitize the most fragile records before Lyle could get his hands on them. Silas was a man of few words, a rugged, wandering specialist with ink-stained fingers and eyes the color of a winter sea. He was an outsider, a ghost in our small town, and the perfect person to play a part because he had no roots to pull up. When I told him what I'd done, I expected him to walk out. Instead, he looked at me for a long, silent minute, his gaze tracing the frantic pulse in my neck, and simply said, "Tell me the rules of the game, Clara." And so, the game began. We had to convince a town of gossips and a vengeful ex-fiancé that we were madly in love. We had to create a history where there was only a contract. But as I stood there in the quiet of the archives, watching Silas move through the stacks with a grace that felt predatory and protective all at once, I felt a tremor of something I couldn't categorize. It wasn't just the fear of being caught. It was the way my skin seemed to hum whenever he stepped into my personal space, a low-frequency vibration that started in the soles of my feet and settled deep in my marrow. We were building a lie, brick by brick, but the foundation was starting to feel dangerously solid. I told myself it was just the stress, the high stakes of the preservation, but every time Silas really looked at me, I felt like a document being unsealed for the first time in a century, exposed to the air and at risk of crumbling under the sheer intensity of the light. Have you ever found yourself caught in a lie so beautiful that you started to wish it were the truth? It's a dangerous place to be, a landscape of shifting shadows where your heart begins to deceive your head. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine the weight of that deception. Imagine the heat of a hand on the small of your back, a hand that doesn't belong to you, yet feels as though it was carved specifically to fit the curve of your spine. Imagine the way a room changes when that person enters it, the air growing thicker, the light growing dimmer, until the only thing you can see is the silhouette of the one who is supposed to be your fake everything. Silas and I were masters of the subtle. We knew that in a town like Oak Haven, overt displays of affection would be seen as performative. Instead, we focused on the lingering glances, the way he would instinctively reach for my hand when we walked into the local diner, or the way I would lean into him just a fraction too much when we were standing in line for coffee. It was a choreography of intimacy, a dance of almosts and somedays. But the thing about dancing is that eventually you stop thinking about the steps and you start feeling the music. The music, in our case, was the tension that crackled between us whenever the doors were closed and the audience was gone. We spent 10 hours a day together in the bowels of the archive building. The basement was a labyrinth of stone and wood, smelling of dust and the faint, sweet scent of old glue. It was a world away from the rain-slicked streets above. In that isolation, the lines we had drawn began to blur. I found myself watching the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he reached for a high shelf. I noticed the way he hummed low in his throat when he was concentrating on a difficult scan, a sound so primal and soothing it made my chest ache. He was a man who lived in the margins, a drifter by trade, yet he handled my fragile history with more tenderness than Lyle ever had. Lyle had treated the archives like a burden, a dusty closet that needed cleaning. Silas treated them like a cathedral. And slowly, he began to treat me the same way. It started with small things, bringing me a tea exactly the way I liked it without asking, or brushing a stray hair from my forehead with a touch so light it could have been a draft. But each time he touched me, the act felt less like a performance and more like a confession. I was a woman who had spent her life protecting the past, but Silas was making me terrified of the future, not because I might lose the archives, but because I might lose the man who was only pretending to be mine. The air in the basement was becoming heavy, saturated with a desire that neither of us dared to name, a slow-burning fire that was consuming the very script we were trying to follow. Before Silas arrived, my life was a series of controlled environments. I was the girl who lived in the basement, the one who preferred the company of ghosts to the living. My relationship with Lyle had been a mistake of convenience, a way to bridge the gap between my family's history and the town's future. He was the golden boy, the man with the plan, and I was the accessory that validated his local credentials. When I finally broke it off, realizing he didn't love me as much as he loved the idea of owning the land the archive sat on, he didn't just walk away. He turned the town against me. He painted me as the difficult daughter, the one who was holding Oakhaven back from its true potential. The baseline of my existence was a quiet, persistent loneliness. I had my books, my maps, and the fading photographs of people I never knew. I thought I was content. I thought the coolness of the stone walls was enough to sustain me. But then came the threat of the demolition, the pressure from the board, and finally, the arrival of Silas. He was the catalyst that disturbed the dust. From the moment he walked into the repository, his boots echoing on the hardwood floors, the atmosphere changed. He didn't fit the mold of a consultant. He was too raw, too present. He carried the scent of the road and the sea, a wildness that didn't belong among the neatly filed records. Our initial interactions were purely professional, or so I tried to tell myself. We spoke in technical terms, DPI settings, metadata standards, preservation tiers. But even then, there was an undercurrent. I would catch him watching me when he thought I was focused on a ledger, his gaze heavy and unreadable. And I would find myself lingering in the aisles where he worked, ostensibly to check on his progress, but really just to be near the heat he radiated. The archives were a cold place, designed to keep the temperature low for the sake of the paper. I was used to wearing thick sweaters and shivering through my shifts. But with Silas there, I was always warm. It was as if he brought a different climate with him, one that was humid and charged with electricity. We were two people who had mastered the art of being alone, now forced into a proximity that was becoming increasingly intimate. The fake dating plan was supposed to be our shield, a way to keep the world at bay while we worked to save the archives. We didn't realize that by building a wall against the outside, we were trapping ourselves inside a space where the only thing left to focus on was each other. The silence of the archives was no longer empty. It was full of the sound of our breathing, the rustle of our clothes, and the unspoken questions that hung in the air like dust motes in a shaft of light. The first time we had to perform in public was at the town's annual Founders' Day picnic. It was a high-stakes environment, filled with the very people whose votes would decide the fate of the repository. Lyle was there, of course, looking polished and predatory in a crisp linen shirt, his arm draped around a woman who looked like she had been designed in a lab to be the perfect developer's wife. I felt small and frayed in my vintage floral dress, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Silas took my hand the moment we stepped onto the grass. His grip was firm, his palm warm and slightly rough. It wasn't the tentative hold of a stranger, it was the possessive grasp of a man who knew exactly what he was holding. "Breathe, Clara," he whispered, his voice a low vibration against my ear. "Just look at me. Ignore the rest of them." And I did. For the next 3 hours, I was anchored by him. We moved through the crowd like a single entity. When we spoke to the board members, Silas would lean in close, his shoulder brushing mine, his hand never leaving the small of my back. It was a masterpiece of body language. He didn't have to say we were in love, his every movement screamed it. He laughed at my jokes before I even finished the punchline. He reached out to brush a crumb from the corner of my mouth with a lingering touch of his thumb that made my knees go weak. But it wasn't just for the audience. There were moments when the crowd drifted away, and we were left in a bubble of our own making. I found myself leaning into his side, not because I had to, but because it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The scent of his cologne, something like sandalwood and rain, was intoxicating. I realized that I wasn't just acting anymore. I was reacting. When he looked down at me and smiled, a genuine, slow-spreading warmth that reached his eyes, I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated desire. Lal watched us from across the park, his eyes narrowing with every laugh we shared. He was a man who hated to lose, and I could see him calculating, trying to find the crack in our armor. But Silas didn't give him an inch. He pulled me closer, his arm wrapping around my waist, his fingers splaying across my hip in a way that was both protective and deeply sensual. In that moment, surrounded by the people who wanted to tear my life apart, I felt more secure than I ever had. The lie was working, but as Silas pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my temple, I realized the real danger wasn't Lyle. It was the fact that I never wanted Silas to let go. The performance was becoming a reality I wasn't prepared to face, a slow-motion collision of two souls who were supposed to be passing in the night. The shifts in our dynamic became more pronounced as the weeks wore on. It was no longer just about the public appearances. The act began to bleed into our private hours in the basement. We were no longer just two people working on a project. We were two people navigating a minefield of mounting attraction. The physical boundaries we had established, the polite distance, the careful avoidance of accidental touch, were eroding, replaced by a magnetic pull that was getting harder to resist. I remember one afternoon when we were working on a set of oversized maps from the late 1800s. They were huge, unwieldy things that required both of us to unroll and stabilize. We were standing on opposite sides of a large oak table, our faces inches apart as we leaned over the delicate paper. I could see the individual lashes of his eyes, the slight stubble on his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly as he concentrated. The air between us was thick, heavy with the scent of old ink and the sudden, overwhelming realization of how close we were. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping an octave. He didn't look up, but his hands stopped moving. "Yes," I whispered, my heart thudding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "The board is coming for a site visit tomorrow. Lyle will be with them. He's going to be looking for any reason to discredit us." "To discredit this?" He gestured vaguely between the two of us. "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to be perfect." "We have to be more than perfect," Silas said, finally looking up. His eyes were dark and tense. "We have to be undeniable." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine where it rested on the edge of the map. His skin was hot, a searing contact that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. He didn't pull away. Instead, he began to slowly stroke the back of my hand with his thumb, a rhythmic, hypnotic movement that made my breath shallow. "Are you ready for that, Clara? To be undeniable." I couldn't speak. All I could do was nod, my gaze locked on his. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving us in a vacuum of pure, raw tension. He wasn't just talking about the board meeting. He was talking about the space between us, the invisible wall that was leaning, cracking, about to fall. The way he looked at me wasn't the look of a man who was pretending. It was the look of a man who was starving, and I was the only thing that could sustain him. I felt a surge of answering hunger, a desperate, aching need to close the distance, to let the lie consume us entirely. But I was terrified. If I gave in, if I let the undeniable happen, what would be left when the project was over and the archives were safe? I was a woman who lived in the past, but Silas was making me crave a present that was as fleeting as a shadow on a wall. The day of the board visit arrived with a relentless, driving rain that hammered against the high, narrow windows of the repository. The building felt like an island in a gray, turbulent sea. Inside, the atmosphere was even more precarious. Lal arrived with the board members, his presence like a toxin in the room. He walked through the aisles with a smirk, touching the shelves with a proprietary air that made my skin crawl. "So, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with false concern as he cornered me near the ledger section. "I hear you and the consultant are getting quite close. A bit sudden, isn't it? Especially for someone who values history so much." I felt the familiar surge of anxiety, the cold knot of fear in my stomach. But before I could respond, a hand settled firmly on my shoulder. Silas was there, his presence a solid, immovable force at my back. "Some things don't need decades to become clear, Lyle," Silas said, his voice calm and dangerously low. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it silenced the room. He pulled me back against his chest, his arm wrapping around my waist in a gesture that was so naturally possessive it made my breath hitch. "When you know what you're looking at, you don't hesitate." But I wouldn't expect a man who sees only property values to understand the value of something truly irreplaceable. Lyle's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He opened his mouth to retort, but the board chair, a stern woman who had always been on the fence, cut him off. "The progress on the digitization is impressive, Clara. And your partner clearly has a deep respect for the collection." For the rest of the tour, Silas never let me go. He kept me tucked into his side, his hand resting on my hip, his fingers occasionally digging in just enough to remind me he was there. It was a bravado performance, a display of dominance that left Lyle fuming and the board convinced. But for me, it was something else entirely. Every time Silas's thumb brushed against my side, every time his chest vibrated against my back as he spoke, I felt a layer of my resistance peel away. When the board finally left and the heavy front doors clicked shut, the silence that followed was deafening. We were standing in the foyer, the dim light of the rainy afternoon casting long shadows across the floor. Silas didn't pull away. He stayed right there, his arms still around me, his heat seeping through the fabric of my dress. I turned in his arms, looking up at him, my heart racing. "Thank you," I whispered. You were incredible." "I wasn't acting, Clara," he said, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine. The air between us charged, the tension reaching a breaking point. The rest of the world, the town, the board, even the archives, faded into insignificance. There was only the sound of the rain, the smell of damp earth, and the man who was holding me as if he would never let go. The distance between us was closing, the fake wall finally crumbling into dust, leaving us exposed and raw in the fading light. The rest of the world did indeed fade away. After the board left, the repository felt like a fortress, a sanctuary where time had no meaning. The rain continued to fall, a relentless curtain of gray that isolated us from the streets of Oakhaven. We retreated to the basement, to the heart of the archives, where the stone walls muffled the sound of the storm and the only light came from the warm glow of the lamps on the workstations. There was a new weight to the air, a density that made every movement feel significant. We didn't talk about what had happened upstairs. We didn't talk about Lyle or the board. We went back to work, but the pretense of professionalism was gone. We moved around each other like celestial bodies caught in each other's gravity, our paths crossing more often than necessary, our hands brushing as we passed documents back and forth. "You're shivering," Silas said, stopping in front of me as I was filing a set of letters. He was right. The chill of the basement was finally catching up to me, or perhaps it was the adrenaline wearing off. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice was unsteady. Without a word, he reached out and took my hands in his. His palms were like branding irons against my cold skin. He began to rub them gently, his gaze focused on our joined hands. "You're always taking care of the past, Clara. Who takes care of you?" The question caught me off guard, hitting a nerve I hadn't realized was exposed. "I take care of myself," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I have to." "You don't have to," he said, finally looking up. His eyes were a turbulent sea of emotion, longing, protectiveness, and a searing, honest desire. "Not tonight. Not with me." He stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that felt like a homecoming. I didn't back away. I couldn't. I was mesmerized by the intensity of his gaze, by the way the light caught the gold flecks in his iris. He let go of my hands and reached up, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, his thumb brushing over my lower lip. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited a fire deep in my belly. I felt my eyes flutter shut, my head tilting back as I leaned into his touch. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and something uniquely Silas, filled my senses, drowning out the smell of dust and old paper. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a lure I was powerless to resist. We were in the most isolated part of the building, surrounded by the stories of thousands of lives, but in that moment, the only story that mattered was ours. The distance between us was measured in heartbeats, each one faster and louder than the last, as the gravity of our shared deception pulled us toward an inevitable, beautiful collision. The silence in the vault was no longer a comfort. It was a living thing, a heavy, velvet pressure that pushed us closer together. I could hear the catch in Silas's breath, a jagged sound that mirrored the frantic rhythm of my own heart. He moved his hand from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in the loose strands of my hair, pulling me just a fraction closer. "This wasn't part of the plan," I whispered, my voice trembling against the heat of his skin. "The plan was a lie," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that I felt in my very bones. This is the only thing that's been real since I got here." He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my lips, a tantalizing promise of what was to come. I reached out, my hands finding the solid breadth of his chest, the fabric of his shirt ruff beneath my fingertips. I could feel the powerful thrum of his heart, a steady, insistent beat that called to my own. The world outside, the rain, the threat of Lyle, the weight of the archives, didn't exist. There was only this small, illuminated circle of space, and the man who was looking at me as if I were the only thing that mattered in the universe. I felt a surge of boldness, a sudden, desperate need to bridge the final inch of distance. I went up on my tiptoes, my lips brushing against his in a touch so light it could have been an accident. But it wasn't an accident. Silas groaned, a deep, primal sound that vibrated through me, and his arms wrapped around me, pulling me flush against his hard, powerful frame. The kiss was a revelation, not the tentative, performative peck we had practiced for the town, but a searing, honest expression of everything we had been suppressing for weeks. It tasted of rain and suppressed longing, of a hunger that had been growing in the dark. My hands slid up his chest, locking behind his neck as I pulled him closer, wanting to disappear into him. The archives, with their thousands of years of history, had never witnessed anything as vital, as raw, as the two of us in that moment. The fake wall was gone, shattered into a million pieces, leaving only the truth of our desire. We were no longer pretending. We were two people who had found something precious in the ruins of a lie, and we were clinging to it as if our lives depended on it. The heat between us was a living thing, a fire that threatened to consume everything we knew, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to let it burn. The barrier of personal space wasn't just broken, it was obliterated. Every point of contact between us felt like a live wire, sparking with a frequency that made my skin feel too tight for my body. Silas's hands were everywhere on my waist, my back, my hair, as if he were trying to memorize the very shape of me through touch alone. He pressed me back against the heavy oak table, the wood cool against my thighs, but I didn't care. All I could feel was him. The air in the vault was thick and humid, the scent of our shared heat mixing with the ancient smell of the archives. It was a heady, intoxicating cocktail that left me lightheaded. I felt a sense of liberation I had never known. For so long, I had been the keeper, the one who stayed behind, the one who protected. But with Silas, I felt like I was being discovered. He wasn't just looking at me, he was seeing me, every hidden part, every buried desire. He pulled back just an inch, his eyes searching mine. "Clara," he breathed, his voice ragged. "Tell me to stop. If this is still the act, if this is just because of the stress, tell me now." I looked at him, at the man who had walked into my life and turned it upside down, and I knew there was no going back. "It's not an act, Silas," I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time. "It was never an act for me. Not really." A look of pure, unadulterated relief washed over his face, followed by a surge of renewed intensity. He leaned back in, his mouth finding the sensitive curve of my neck, his stubble grazing my skin and sending waves of pleasure through my body. I arched my back, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, my fingers digging into his shoulders. The heat radiating between us was a physical force, a pulsing energy that seemed to vibrate the very shelves around us. I could feel the trembling in his hands, a sign of the restraint he was fighting to maintain, and it only fueled my own longing. We were standing on the edge of a precipice, the fake world far below us, and the only way was down. The anticipation was a searing weight in my chest, a beautiful, agonizing tension that was stretching toward its breaking point. Every touch, every whispered word, every shared breath was a step closer to the edge, and I was more than ready to fall. The tension reached a tipping point where words were no longer enough, where even the air between us felt like a barrier that needed to be dissolved. Silas's hands moved with a new, urgent purpose, his fingers tracing the lines of my body with a reverence that made me feel like the most precious artifact in the room. He moved from my neck back to my lips, his kiss deeper now, more possessive, as if he were claiming every part of me. I felt a strange, beautiful sense of duality. I was acutely aware of the setting, the rows of ledgers, the smell of vellum, the distant sound of the rain, but at the same time, I was completely untethered. My world had shrunk to the size of Silas's embrace. The heat between us was no longer just a feeling, it was an environment, a private climate that existed only for the two of us. He shifted his weight, his thighs sliding between mine, and the sudden, intimate contact made my breath hitch. I could feel the power in him, the controlled strength that he was using to hold me so gently, yet so firmly. It was a dance of power and surrender, of two people who had spent their lives in control finally letting go. "You're so beautiful, Clara," he whispered against my skin, his voice a low, melodic thrum. "I've wanted this since the first day I saw you in that dusty office, looking like you were ready to take on the world with nothing but an old book and a scowl." I laughed, a soft, breathless sound that was lost against his lips. I wasn't scowling. I was concentrating. "You were magnificent," he corrected, his hand sliding up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing over my cheekbone. "And you're magnificent now." The honesty in his voice was more intoxicating than any physical touch. It was the sound of a man who was no longer playing a part, who was laying himself bare in the quiet of the night. I felt a surge of answering honesty, a need to let him see the depth of my own feeling. I pulled him closer, my body molding to his, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against his chest. We were no longer two people pretending to be in love to save a building. We were two people who had found a truth so powerful it had rendered the lie obsolete. The tipping point had been crossed, the fall had begun, and as Silas's hands found the curve of my waist, I knew that whatever happened next, my life would never be the same. The sensual peak arrived not with a sudden explosion, but with a slow, agonizingly beautiful deepening of the connection. It was as if every touch we had shared over the past weeks, every fake handhold, every performative glance, had been leading to this singular moment. The archives, usually so cold and clinical, felt like a warm, living womb, sheltering us from the harsh realities of the world outside. Silas lifted me onto the edge of the workstation, his hands firm on my hips, his eyes never leaving mine. The movement was fluid, effortless, and it brought us to eye level, our breath mingling in the small space between us. I felt a sense of profound vulnerability and equally profound power. I was exposed to him, yes, but he was equally exposed to me. He leaned in, his lips grazing mine, his tongue tracing the shape of my mouth with a slow deliberation that made my toes curl. I responded with equal fervor, my hands sliding into his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer, wanting to consume and be consumed. The physical sensations were overwhelming, the heat of his skin, the scent of cedar and rain, the sound of our mingled breathing, and the rhythmic, heavy thrum of our hearts. It was poetic, a silent dialogue of skin and soul. Every movement was a verse, every touch a stanza. We were writing our own history in the shadows of the past, a story that would never be recorded in any ledger, but would be etched forever in our memories. The world of Oakhaven, the board, the threat of demolition, it all felt like a dream, a distant, fading memory. The only reality was the man in front of me, the way his hands felt on my skin, and the way his presence filled the empty spaces in my heart. The climax was a crescendo of feeling, a wave of pure, unadulterated emotion that swept over us both. It wasn't just about the physical. It was about the shattering of the isolation we had both lived in for so long. In the quiet of the vault, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, we had found a living, breathing truth. As Silas buried his face in the crook of my neck, his body trembling with the force of his emotion, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. We were no longer pretending. We were real. We were undeniable. And in that moment, that was more than enough. The aftermath was a soft, heavy-breathing silence that was even more intimate than the peak itself. We stayed locked in each other's arms, the only sound the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof far above. The air in the vault was still warm, saturated with the scent of our shared heat, but the frantic energy had been replaced by a deep, resonant calm. Silas kept his forehead pressed against mine, his hands still resting on my hips, as if he were afraid I might disappear if he let go. I leaned into him, my head resting on his shoulder, my eyes closed as I simply felt the presence of him. The afterglow wasn't just a physical sensation, it was an emotional one, a feeling of being seen, understood, and accepted. "What now?" I whispered, the words small and fragile in the vast silence of the archives. Silas pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes soft and filled with a quiet intensity. "Now," he said, his voice a low, soothing vibration. "We finish what we started. We save this place. But we do it together." No more lies, Clara. No more acting. I felt a lump form in my throat, a surge of emotion that I couldn't quite contain. For so long, I had been fighting this battle alone, carrying the weight of my mother's legacy like a burden. But now I had Silas. He wasn't just a consultant or a fake fiancé. He was my partner, in every sense of the word. He reached out and brushed a stray hair from my face, his touch so tender it made my heart ache. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara. Not unless you want me to." "I don't," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I never want you to go." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes, and kissed me once more, a soft, lingering touch that was a promise of the future. The archives were still there, the records were still fragile, and the board was still a threat. But as we sat there in the dim light of the vault, the rain finally beginning to taper off, I knew that we were ready for whatever came next. We had built a truth out of a lie, a foundation that was stronger than any stone or wood. The afterglow wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that we would write together, one word, one touch, one day at a time. The following morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a brilliant, watery light over the town of Oakhaven. The air was crisp and clean, the scent of the sea stronger than usual. I walked into the repository with a new sense of purpose, the memory of the night before a warm, steady flame in my chest. Silas was already there, working at his station. When he looked up and saw me, a look of pure, unadulterated affection crossed his face. He didn't say anything, but the way he watched me as I crossed the room told me everything I needed to know. The fake wall was gone, but the professional boundaries remained, at least for now. We had a job to do. Over the next few weeks, we worked with a renewed intensity. The digitization project was completed ahead of schedule, and the evidence we had gathered against Lyle, his secret meetings with developers, his plans to circumvent zoning laws, was enough to turn the board permanently against him. The repository was saved, and with it, my mother's legacy. But the real victory was the one that didn't make the local news. It was the way Silas and I moved through the world together. The town of Oakhaven still thought we were engaged, and for a while, we let them believe it. It was easier than explaining the truth, and besides, the lie was becoming more and more indistinguishable from reality every day. The physical separation was the hardest part. When the project was officially over and Silas's contract was up, there was a moment of true uncertainty. He had a life of wandering, of moving from one archive to the next, one town to the next. And I had my roots here, in the cold stone of the repository. "I have to go to Boston next week," he said one evening, as we sat on the steps of the building, watching the sunset over the harbor. "There's a collection at the university that needs a specialist." I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. "I know." He turned to me, taking my hand in his. "But I'm coming back, Clara. I've spent my whole life moving, thinking that the only way to be free was to never stay in one place. But you've shown me that some things are worth staying for. Some things are worth building a life around." He pulled me into his arms, and as we sat there in the fading light, the memory of our night in the vault washing over me, I knew that he meant it. The separation was only temporary. The connection we had forged in the shadows of a lie was too strong to be broken by a few hundred miles. We were two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and we weren't about to let each other go. The lingering memory of our fake relationship was the foundation of our very real future, a story that was just beginning to be told. Every story has its secrets, those quiet moments of realization that change everything. For Silas and me, It was the moment we realized that the act was no longer an act, that the fake intimacy we had practiced for the world had become the most real thing in our lives. We saved the archives, yes, but more importantly, we saved each other from a life of isolation and control. Now, when I walk through the aisles of the repository, I don't just see the past. I see the future. I see the place where I found the man I love, the place where a lie turned into a truth so powerful it changed the course of my life. The silence of the archives is no longer empty. It's full of the echoes of our shared history, the whispers of the night we spent together in the vault, and the promise of all the nights to come. I want to thank the anonymous listener from Seattle for sharing this beautiful, seductive story with us. It's a reminder that sometimes, the things we pretend to be are the things we are most meant to become. If you have a story of your own, a secret desire, a hidden romance, or a moment where the lines between reality and fantasy blurred, I would love to hear it. Send your stories to our channel, and you might hear them featured in an upcoming video. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who appreciates the beauty of a slow burn romance. Until next time, keep your secrets close and your desires closer. This is the Erotica Sensual and Seductive channel, signing off with a final, lingering thought. What lie are you telling yourself today that might just become your truth tomorrow? #####.